Hello and welcome to this THE webinar where we're discussing one of the most significant transitions that higher education has ever undergone, the move to a world that is, for the time being at least, digital first. I say for the time being, but I think we would all acknowledge that the events of 2020 have changed the way that universities deliver teaching and learning on a permanent basis. However, we don't know exactly how yet. And so for university leaders, and those responsible for setting the direction and focus of their teaching strategies in particular, many challenges and of course opportunities lie ahead. The same is true for university faculty, who have had to reinvent the way they deliver courses and interact and support students during the course of the pandemic. The initial response to the crisis may have passed, but this is an ongoing process, and Times Higher Education is delighted today to be launching THE Campus, a new platform for sharing resource and best practices in online teaching and learning. The goal is to develop a space where higher education's global community can network and share what works as universities and academics transform their teaching practice together. THE Campus is being launched with 3 founding partners, ASU, Cintana and Microsoft. And I'm delighted now to be joined by Michael Crow, President of ASU, a true pioneer of this transition to new modes of delivery and the author of a number of books on the future of higher education. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here, John. Nice to see you.
I wonder if I could start, Michael, by asking you to reflect on ASU's journey. And in the spirit of THE Campus, I do want this conversation to be very practical and focused on helping others learn from your experience. ASU clearly embraced online and remote learning as a long-term strategy and an area of special focus and expertise well before the pandemic hit. And having done that as a leader, can I ask you, what were the key decisions that you had to make at the outset? And what have been the key obstacles and challenges that you've had to overcome during that transition?
Well, John, I think the most important thing to understand about our transition to a technology-enhanced learning environment, teaching, learning, and discovery environment, is that we started first by looking at ourselves, looking on campus in our environment. And what we found was ourselves wanting. We had inadequate tools and techniques that allowed us to be able to deal with a very diverse student body coming in from a wide range of cultures and a wide range of backgrounds, all intellectually capable of advancing through the university, but not each prepared in the same way. We also found ourselves unable to really offer and deliver on the rhetoric of broad learning, that is majoring in lyrical opera while also double majoring in biochemistry. And so what we needed to do was to find a way to technologically enhance our learning environment at the university. And then from that, what we found that we could do was then we could take the same faculty, the same creativity, and project out with these tools to reach other learners who didn't have the means or the ability or the time to actually physically come to the university across the entirety of their life. And so the key thing for us was the opening up of our culture to the introduction of technology in the operation of the university itself. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't thousands of courses that are small seminars with faculty members engaged on a one-on-one, face-to-face basis. There are, but there are also hundreds of courses that are technologically mediated on campus and dozens of courses that are essentially robotic in nature, highly advanced, interactive, intelligently augmented courses for learning. And so what we learned from this was to change our culture, introduce technology that then empowered us to do all these new things.
Interesting that you talk about culture. And of course, universities are fundamentally about their staff. They're a community of scholars more than anything else. And I would like to come back to this question of the skills and potentially the personnel that you need within the university to deliver this particular type of higher education, whether it's different, how you sort of bring faculty with you. Before I do though, for many other institutions who've had to embrace this shift to remote learning in 2020 and now in 2021 as an emergency measure, it was perhaps slightly different from your experience, so necessity rather than a strategic choice. And I wonder again, from your position as a leader of a university, someone that's done this as a president, whether you have any advice about the decisions that those universities should be taking now in early 2021 to navigate the coming year, having done the emergency transition. You know, what longer term choices need to be made now to set things up optimally for the years ahead?
Well, staying focused on the notion of trying to be practical here, it goes to the notion of how you see yourself. So are you prepared for the disruptions of the future, the additional pandemics, the climate change disruptions, social disruptions, things that lie ahead, technological disruptions that lie ahead, or not? And most universities and colleges are not, because they're in a fixed modality. And so the first and most important thing is mindset. How are you going to build a more adaptable institution? And then second, once you've decided to do that, is empowering and enabling the powerful faculty. So for us, it's all about empowerment of the faculty. And so we actually think of our faculty now as super faculty. They have face-to-face students, they have graduate students, they have research activities, they have online students, they have synchronous students. And so what we've done is we found a way to find technological solutions for them at no burden to them, no cost to them or the departments, in which they can then fulfill their teaching, learning, and discovery objectives to both their on-campus face-to-face, fully immersed audiences, as well as others. And so the answer really is preparation goes to mindset. Universities and colleges in general are not high speed and not adaptive, and technology allows them to be both if they can make the culture shift also.
Do you have any sense, Michael, of how to bring faculty with you? I mean, you talked about super faculty. It sounds as if the culture shift has been relatively smooth at ASU. You may say that wasn't the case. I'm sure there were obstacles that you had to overcome. Do you have any sense of the mix of faculty and skills required to deliver excellent teaching and learning online? How you sort of address any changes or upskilling that might be required amongst existing staff, and how you look at what additional skills you may need to bring in to augment what you already have within the institution?
Well, several things, and these are each important. One, we didn't make anyone do anything. We didn't make a faculty member become technologically advanced. We didn't make a department go online. We created a massive centralized utility called Ed Plus at ASU that can offer whatever level of creativity, instructional design, creative design, knowledge navigation, tools, technologies, assets, whatever, to any individual faculty member, any department, any school, and then they can decide in total pedagogical control and total academic control what they want to do. And then we also set up financial mechanisms and financial incentives for those units to be able to do that. And then we provided this crack team, which greatly augmented our faculty, tremendously augmented their ability to be super faculty. And so the key then was the construction of the mechanism that allowed for creativity to be accelerated. And then in also offering to whoever wants to do it, advanced levels of training, advanced training in digital education, advanced training in Zoom systems technology. Thousands and thousands of our faculty members, without a single request, have all taken that training, and they've augmented their ability now to use these assets. So we built the assets that augment the faculty, offered self-selection for training to use those assets, and then create an environment where people want to do this. They're excited about doing it.
I mean, that sounds like an incredibly supportive environment for faculty, an incredible resource to have within the university. Also sounds like an incredible investment. I mean, I may be wrong, but it sounds expensive. And clearly resources are tight for institutions. ASU is itself a public institution. You know, I'm sure you have choices every time you spend money on anything. Could you just talk us through, you know, from your position as somebody who has to ultimately be responsible for the bottom line of your institution as well, what the investment case was there, how you put that together, and so on?
So the key to this, being as practical as possible, is to take a look at the environment that you want to be and its financial structure versus the environment that you're in and its financial structure. So we are investing and have invested massive amounts of energy. I think we're putting $40 or $50 million a year just into the base utility of the Ed Plus unit. And the technology partnerships that we have, and then making that available. That's a massive expenditure, but not really when you think about it, because then it has allowed us to have higher levels of graduation and retention for our students. It has allowed us to have higher levels of success for our students, double majoring, triple majoring, more students going from undergraduate degrees into graduate degrees. It's allowed us to then open access to the institution for asynchronous online students in what we call ASU Online. This year we'll have 85,000 degree-seeking students. So we basically have about the same number of on-campus students as we have online students. So imagine with the same faculty and a technological addition to that faculty member, we have tremendously positive outcomes on campus, and we're teaching one additional degree-seeking student with an entire economy associated with that, with a higher margin of return, back to the practical notion, back to the university, for us to then fulfill our overall mission. So it turns out that at the end of the day, it was an essential and relatively minor investment that greatly enhanced and expanded the university's financial structure. So yes, we're a public university of about $4 billion a year of revenue, but only about $300 million a year of that revenue actually comes from the government in the form of an appropriation. All the rest is a function of this activity that we're talking about.
And you were obviously able to persuade the governance structures at ASU that this was the right investment to do, the right thing to do. Do you think other universities now operating in a world when perhaps every institution should be looking to do this will find it easier or more difficult to make the case for those investments that are necessary to support this shift?
So it would be easy for universities that have decided that their outcomes are measured by the students that graduate and the success they have, the communities that they serve and the success they have, the economies that they're a part of and the success they have. And so it's easier for them to do that, to measure their success, because then academic successes then contribute to those. Now, if you're only measuring academic successes and you're in a traditional structure, then this will be very argumentative because it will be seen as depleting assets or resources that are critical to the success of the faculty. We are arguing that there is room for some universities, we're a prototype of this, where we can be wildly successful from a research perspective and a scholarship perspective and a creativity perspective, and manage through technological enhancements large numbers of highly diverse students pursuing our educational programs. And so the institutions have to decide what they are. Some absolutely socially must decide that they're social scale institutions, and some will obviously decide and continue to be institutions that are more narrowly focused, and that's not a negative. They're just more narrowly focused on the students that gather with them only.
Yeah, I'd be interested to return perhaps, if we have time, to this idea of what diversity within the higher education sector looks like, because I think it's one of the great strengths of the university sector that you do have many different models, different approaches, different sizes and shapes of institution. I wonder if I could just ask about staff resilience. One of the things that we've seen over the course of the last year, I think, is that it's incredibly tough doing everything remotely. And many faculty report being close to burnout after 2020. It was an emergency transition. People have been working, flat out, dawn till dusk to make things work, and that's sort of manageable for a time, but it becomes increasingly difficult to sustain that on an ongoing basis. What advice would you have for universities thinking about how they can better manage this way of operating sustainably?
So first, I appreciate very much this notion of people being burned out. This is stressful for everyone. We're operating in new ways and moving in new directions and so forth. So I get that and understand that. I think the thing that we've tried to do is we've tried to make everything as flexible as possible. Absolutely as flexible as possible. We're open. The university is open. We have 75,000 students here with us. We're offering many courses and classes face-to-face. Many are not being offered face-to-face. Everyone has the option to Zoom into any classroom, faculty member or student. We have strict COVID protocols, mandatory random testing. We have ubiquitous testing within the university. We're testing everyone, students, staff, and faculty. And that's then created an environment of comparative safety in terms of us finding a way to come together and work. And so what I would say is that one has to build in this notion of flexibility and allow faculty members, to the extent possible, to adjust and adapt based on their medical circumstance, their family circumstance, and so forth. And so that's what we've tried to build in. Now we have to figure out what that means then going forward once COVID-19 is no longer a pandemic and is just a virus that then is still amongst us, but not at the pandemic stage. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but we know that we now have greatly enhanced the flexibility of all things within our institution. Let's just take a research lab. Research labs now could engage researchers in real time using Zoom technologies at the highest level imaginable that we never thought possible, bringing in high school students, bringing in other researchers, allowing people to pursue research activities in synchronous Zoom, what we call ASU sync modes. And so what we see now is that we used to have this many alternatives. Now we have this many alternatives, and we're looking at how we move forward that way and running the university in new kinds of ways, in additional kinds of ways.
I'd like to ask you, if I could, about from a student perspective. You talked about the ways in which your students' studies have changed, the sort of multiple majors they might be taking at any one time. Obviously, the way that teaching and learning is delivered. Also, more students simply studying at ASU than would have been possible were you not operating in the way that you do. I wonder if you could give a sense for other universities thinking through how best to prepare students differently, if you do need to prepare them differently, for a hybrid and remote learning experience versus the sort of pure face-to-face. I know there's no such thing as pure face-to-face, and everywhere is a little bit hybrid, but are there fundamental differences in the way that students need to be prepared for study in this way?
I think there are. It is the case, thankfully, that people born after 1996 are already kind of a different species. We call them Homo sapien.nets. You know, they basically are connected to the net, connected to supercomputing devices, connected to learning enhancement tools. And so what's needed for preparation is how are we going to deal with the more complicated aspects of learning related to socialization and community building and teamwork and so forth. And so the key for all of us, including the students and the faculty and the staff, is to figure out how to keep all of that going. Not only going, but how to enhance it. We found that in some Zoom, what we call ASU Sync modalities, we're getting superior outcomes in terms of academic and pedagogical product. And in others, maybe not as good. And so we've got to help students to understand how to adjust and adapt to the different kinds of learning environments. And ultimately, we will do that by having a better prepared faculty and a better prepared staff, setting expectations in the right kind of way, helping students to find a way across a range of options. And so it's about maybe building more navigation guides, helping people to navigate a more complicated system in productive ways that are perhaps more conducive to the way that a particular student learns also. So finding their own path for learning optimization.
In addition to the impact on education, social networks in the old-fashioned sense of the word, actually, you know, having people that you see every day in the classroom were incredibly important to the I suppose mental well-being of students. And there's a lot of concern now about issues around mental well-being within higher education. Do you have any thoughts on how best to ensure that faculty are able to support the mental health of their students when they perhaps aren't seeing them physically in the way that they used to quite so often?
Well, what we've said to our faculty, which is some are doing this and some are not, is that you have your students, yes, in your Zoom mode and so forth and so on, but that doesn't mean you can't meet with a student outdoors if you feel comfortable outdoors, masked in the right room, in the right distance. And so we're encouraging faculty to do that. But in addition to that, we think that there's innumerable pathways, and we're encouraging and empowering this, to meet, just as you and I are talking right here, right now. Even perhaps more than we would have in the old environment, because in the old environment, there was who got up close to the professor at the end of the class, who was brave enough to get office hours. There was the complexity of all these things. And now there's perhaps more ease of movement and ease of connection. And then I'll say one other thing relative to the social framework. So one of the things that we found in all of this, particularly in the Zoom modes and in the online modes, is that we're getting more voices. In a classroom setting, sometimes there's an alpha male or an alpha female that then is dominant in the class, and other students who have just as important a set of things to say, they don't say it because they feel intimidated by that person. And so some of that sociology is now gone. And so what we're looking to do is to really understand all of this social framework and find ways that we can enhance learning. And then let me also add that, we've come a long distance, as have lots of other, if not most other colleges and universities, in designing and deploying telehealth and telemedicine tools and techniques for deeper psychological counseling or personal counseling or health and well-being counseling. So we're also adding all of that. And we think we're going to end up with some better outcomes as a function of that than we would have before.
Interesting. And of course, one of the other stresses and strains on students very often is their finances. There's a lot of debate about the cost of higher education in many of the systems around the world. And I think there's the idea that has sprung up over the course of this pandemic that a shift to remote delivery means cheaper higher education, and that should somehow be passed on to the consumer, in this case, the student. Is there any truth in that? And if there isn't, how do you think universities should counter what's proving to be quite a compelling argument for some people that online means less expensive?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question. So first, just on this notion of cost, we work very hard to control costs. Our in-state students have a net tuition of under $4,000. We've kept our costs modest by comparison, and we do that through efficiency and effectiveness, in which these technologies are also important. But having said that, at least in our mode that we're talking right now, there is no cost reduction per se, because if anything, there's a cost acceleration. Because now we're using a technological set of systems to mediate between the learners who are still coming together live, still interacting. The faculty is still engaged in the same way. In fact, the faculty now is engaged in multiple ways at the same time, which makes it even a little bit more stressful. So this notion that somehow, quote unquote, online learning, which has been demeaned by lots of groups out there. I sent off to one of the Ivy League presidents when the pandemic got going a rather direct note that said, please have your law school stop telling people that online learning doesn't work, because they're obviously clueless and don't have any idea what they're talking about. Well, then that sent a signal through the system that somehow online learning was a lesser thing. So there's full immersion synchronous learning like we're doing right now. This can be very powerful. In fact, I taught last semester or last spring semester. I'm teaching this semester also. We're finding these technologies to be very, very powerful, very enhancing to the learning process itself. And then there's online asynchronous learning, which we're finding tremendous learning outcomes from. And so largely people that are talking about these things, they're just not well informed. They just don't know the kinds of learning results that you can get. And then relative to the costs, there isn't a reduction in costs. There might be a stabilization in costs, and there might be a way to do more to get 2 degrees or 3 degrees for the cost of 1 degree. But to lower the actual cost, we don't see that happening yet.
What did that Ivy League president say in reply?
He said, I can't control that law school.
Fair enough.
I used to be at Columbia University in the Ivy League on the faculty, and I was deputy provost there. And so I understood what he was saying back to me, but it was just kind of almost, I don't want to say, it was almost like, he said, well, they just say these kinds of things all the time. And I said, well, they just keep communicating things they don't know anything about. And he says, that is so.
One of the strengths of many university sectors, as we discussed earlier, has been diversity of provision. The idea that it is not homogenous. There are different types of institutions doing different things for different people. Do you think, is there any risk that the shift to a sort of digital first approach, blended approach on a permanent basis, detracts from that in any way, or do you think that will be a false concern?
Well, I think that diversity will continue. I think the risk is that we all drift off the cliff that some for-profit universities have gone down, which is that they forget or don't know or never knew or never wanted to participate in the notion of a faculty. And a faculty, which is a living, breathing, interactive contributor to what we call the core of knowledge. And so we're, for instance, a regular university with over 5,000 faculty members. Thousands of them are involved in discovery and creativity and heavy research. And we've got hundreds of millions of dollars of research activities at the core. We spend tens of millions of dollars a year on a library that's at the core. We have a staff of hundreds of people working to curate knowledge and synthesize knowledge and so forth and so on. And so if the digitization of teaching and learning activities moves away from the core of knowledge, then it will fail, as it has in so many for-profit cases and in some not-for-profit universities. But if it stays attached to the core, then the ship is moored in the right way to the right thing. And so that's the big worry that I have in digitization.
Yeah, really interesting. Adding value rather than diminishing what a university is all about. And I suppose a related question to that, the higher education is a sector where prestige and reputation matter hugely. Do you think online learning proficiency will become a key element of a university's reputation in the future?
Well, that's going to be hard, because prestige right now is really set based on something connected to your accent, which is the two great original British universities at Oxford and Cambridge, which is this notion not of mass education, but of elite education. And so right now, with the coin of the realm in American and British and higher education around the world, really is too much that status is a function of selectivity, and status is a function of who you admit versus who you don't admit. And I'm not saying that that's bad in and of itself. I'm just saying that means then that online is the polar opposite of that, where you're dealing with larger classes and larger masses and larger groups of people. In our case, everyone that is in our online programs is equally qualified and meets all of our admission standards to attend the university, which means we believe that they're highly qualified to be able to come to the university. But what we're hopeful of is that people begin breaking up and classifying universities and colleges based on their missions, differentiated missions. We now see ourselves as a national service university, as the emergent prototype in the US of something that we're calling the fifth wave. So 5 waves of dramatic changes of institutional design in the US. And a fifth wave research university is not the same as Bennington College in Vermont, which is a classical American version of a British college at Oxford or Cambridge, which is a version of a Greek academy. Sort of, it's a, even those colleges are versions of Plato's academy. And so what we need is new classifications. And so if you have online programs, those should be compared against other online programs in their own right.
I'll ask one last question. We started the conversation talking about ASU's history here and the fact that you were doing a lot of the things that universities had to do in the last year well before others followed. Nevertheless, I'm sure that you will have reflected over the last year. The pandemic will also have changed things that you're doing. What, if you could give us one thing that you'll do differently on an ongoing basis as a result of the disruption of the last 9 to 12 months, what would that be?
I think where we're really focused, if you limit me to just one, is that we now know that we can be ubiquitous in our connectivity. We can break down almost, we can be anywhere. We can engage with a determined learner at any point in their life and advance that person for a more powerful personal outcome and a more powerful social outcome. And we used to think of ourselves as constrained. We now no longer think of ourselves as constrained.
Michael Crow, that was a really interesting conversation. I'm afraid we're out of time. I would like to say a huge thank you to you, in particular for ASU being involved as a founding partner for THE Campus. I think it's a really exciting joint venture and something that should contribute a great deal to global higher education. But thank you very much for talking to me today.
Yes, appreciate it very much, John. Thank you. Thank you for the time.